She didn't lose her empire slowly. It was taken from her overnight, and by morning, the name she had spent years building meant nothing. Because in an industry where reputation is everything, one accusation was enough to erase a legacy. And Elena Voss learned that the hard way when headlines began to spread faster than the truth ever could, accusing her of stealing designs, copying ideas, and building her success on someone else's work. And the worst part wasn't the accusation itself, it was how quickly people believed it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Elena Voss was not just another fashion designer trying to make a name for herself. She was already there, already respected, already recognized in rooms where people spent decades trying to get noticed. Her designs had been worn by celebrities, featured in top magazines, and praised for their originality. And that was exactly why the scandal hit harder. Because when someone at the top falls, people don't question it. They watch, they judge, and they move on, leaving the person at the center of it all to deal with the damage alone. The accusation came from someone unexpected, a rising competitor who claimed Elena had stolen an entire collection before it was launched, presenting evidence that looked convincing enough to turn public opinion overnight. And within hours, brands began pulling out, partnerships were paused, investors grew silent, and the same people who once praised her suddenly distanced themselves as if they had never known her at all. And Elena realized something in that moment that no one prepares you for. Success attracts attention, but it also attracts people waiting for the perfect moment to take it from you. She tried to fight it. Of course she did. She released statements, denied the claims, pushed back against the narrative that was forming around her. But the truth didn't matter anymore, because perception had already taken its place. And in the world she lived in, perception was everything. And when it turned against you, there was very little you could do to fix it without power. Real power, the kind she didn't have on her own. At the same time, in a completely different world, Adrian Cole was facing a deadline he could not ignore, a condition set by his father years ago, one that had seemed distant at the time but now stood directly in front of him. Unavoidable, clear, and simple. If he wanted full control of the family empire, if he wanted access to the assets that had been built over decades, he needed to be married before his 34th birthday. And that deadline was only days away. Adrian Cole was not the kind of man who struggled to find women. That had never been the problem. He had options, more than enough, but none of them were suitable for what he needed, because this wasn't about attraction or convenience. It was about image, stability, and control, and the women in his life had always been temporary, chosen for moments, not for permanence. And now, for the first time, he needed something real, or at least something that looked real enough to convince his father. He didn't believe in love, not in the way people described it. To him, relationships were strategic, built on mutual benefit, maintained as long as they served a purpose, and ended the moment they no longer did. And that mindset had worked for him in every aspect of his life, until now, because this situation required something different, something he had never needed before: commitment. While Adrian was trying to solve a problem he had never prepared for, Elena was reaching a point where options were running out. Every door she knocked on closed just as quickly. Every conversation ended the same way: polite rejection, cautious distance, and the unspoken understanding that no one wanted to be associated with someone whose name had become controversial overnight. And for the first time in years, she felt powerless. That night, she did something she hadn't done in a long time. She stopped trying to fix everything, and instead, she walked away from it. Just for a moment, just long enough to breathe, to think, to escape the noise that had been building around her since the scandal broke. And that was how she ended up at a bar she wouldn't normally go to, sitting alone, trying to figure out what her next move would be. She already knew the answer. Even if she didn't want to admit it, she needed an alliance, someone powerful enough to shift the narrative, someone whose name carried enough weight to silence the doubts surrounding hers. But people like that didn't come easily. And they certainly didn't offer help without expecting something in return. And then she met him. Adrian Cole didn't approach her immediately. He noticed her first, not because she stood out in the way people usually did, but because she didn't try to. There was something in the way she carried herself, controlled, composed, even in a moment where she clearly wasn't, and that caught his attention in a way he didn't expect, because men like him were used to being approached, not the other way around. When he finally walked over, the conversation was simple at first, nothing that would suggest what was about to come next. Just two strangers exchanging words in a place where neither of them expected anything meaningful to happen. But Adrian was not a man who wasted time, and it didn't take long for him to recognize exactly who she was. Elena Voss, the woman everyone was talking about, the woman whose name was currently falling apart in public. And suddenly, what had been a coincidence no longer felt like one. Elena didn't realize it immediately, not until the conversation shifted, not until Adrian began asking questions that were too precise to be casual, and when she finally understood that he knew exactly who she was, she expected judgment, dismissal, maybe even the same quiet distance she had been receiving from everyone else. Instead, he made her an offer. Not sympathy, not advice, an offer. A contract marriage. It sounded absurd at first, something that belonged in a story, not real life. But Adrian explained it in the simplest way possible. He needed a wife, someone who could stand beside him, someone credible enough to satisfy his father's condition, and she needed power, protection, and a way to restore her name. And in his mind, the solution was obvious. They could solve each other's problems. The terms were clear: 1 year, no emotional involvement, no interference in each other's personal lives, complete discretion, and when the time was over, they would go their separate ways. No complications, no expectations, just an agreement built on necessity. Elena should have said no. Everything about it went against what she believed in, against the independence she had built her life around, against the idea of tying herself to a man she didn't know, a man who clearly saw relationships as transactions rather than connections. But when she thought about what she was about to lose, when she considered the years of work that were slipping away from her, the decision became less about pride and more about survival. So she said yes. And in that moment, without fully realizing it, Elena Voss didn't just agree to a contract. She stepped into a world where control would no longer belong to her alone. And Adrian Cole, the man who never believed in permanence, had just made the one decision that would change everything, not just for her, but for himself. The contract was signed the next morning, not with hesitation, not with emotion, but with the kind of precision that defined both of them, because this wasn't about love, it wasn't about trust, it was about survival. And as Elena Voss placed her signature beside Adrian Cole's, she understood something clearly. Whatever this was, it had an end date. And that was the only thing that made it feel safe. Because in 1 year, this would all be over, and she would walk away with her name restored and her life back in her control. Adrian didn't waste time. He never did. And within hours, everything was already in motion, arrangements made, schedules adjusted, and by the time the day ended, Elena's life had already begun to shift in ways she couldn't fully process yet. Because stepping into Adrian Cole's world was not something you eased into. It was something that consumed you completely, and the first real test of that came sooner than she expected. His birthday, the deadline his father had set, the moment everything needed to look real. When Adrian told her she would be attending as his partner, not just as a guest, but as the woman he intended to marry, Elena felt the weight of the decision she had made settle in for the first time. Because this was no longer just an agreement on paper, this was public, visible, something people would see, judge, and believe, and there would be no space for mistakes. The event itself was exactly what she expected from someone like Adrian Cole: controlled, exclusive, filled with people who carried influence without needing to announce it. And as they arrived together, Elena understood immediately that this wasn't just about introducing her to his father. This was about introducing her to a world that would now be watching her closely, analyzing every move, every expression, every detail that could confirm or question her place beside him. Adrian's father was not an easy man to impress. That much was clear from the moment Elena met him. His presence carried the kind of authority that didn't need to be loud, and his eyes, sharp and observant, studied her in a way that made it impossible to hide behind appearances. But Elena had spent years building herself in environments just like this, and she did not falter. She stood her ground, composed, confident, exactly the kind of woman who looked like she belonged next to Adrian. And that was all that mattered. When Adrian introduced her as the woman he was going to marry, there was a pause, brief but noticeable, the kind that carried weight without words. And then something shifted, not dramatically, not outwardly, but enough, because his father nodded, slowly, thoughtfully, as if confirming something to himself. And in that moment, Elena realized she had passed a test she didn't even know she was being given. But what neither of them controlled was the attention that followed. Because by the time the night ended, photos had already begun to surface, taken discreetly but intentionally. Adrian Cole, the man who avoided public relationships, seen with a woman, not just any woman, but Elena Voss, the same woman whose name had been at the center of a scandal days before. And suddenly, the narrative began to change. People started asking questions, not about the accusation, but about her connection to him. And in a world where power shaped perception, that shift was everything. By morning, the headlines looked different. Not erased, but redirected. And for the first time since the scandal broke, Elena saw something she hadn't seen in days. Control returning. Adrian's father did not delay his approval. In fact, he accelerated everything. Because to him, this was not just a personal decision. It was strategic. And if Adrian had finally chosen someone, then there was no reason to wait. But Adrian had already made his stance clear. There would be no grand wedding, no public spectacle, nothing that would tie them together in a way that couldn't be undone. And while his father didn't fully agree, he accepted it. So the next day, quietly, without attention, without the elaborate display people expected, Adrian Cole and Elena Voss got married in a courtroom. No audience, no celebration, just signatures, and a promise that neither of them intended to keep beyond a year. But what began as an arrangement started changing faster than either of them expected. Because living in the same space, sharing the same name, existing within the same world, created something neither contract nor logic could control: familiarity, and with it, awareness, the kind that grows slowly, unnoticed at first, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Adrian began to notice things about Elena that had nothing to do with the agreement. The way she carried herself even when no one was watching. The way she worked, focused, driven, unwilling to let the scandal define her. The way she didn't rely on him even when she had every reason to. And that independence, the very thing that should have kept him distant, began to draw his attention instead. And Elena noticed things too. The way Adrian operated, controlled but not careless, distant but not indifferent. The way he handled situations without unnecessary words. The way his presence alone shifted how people behaved. And more importantly, the way he began to involve himself in her situation, not as part of the contract, but in ways that felt intentional. Because clearing her name was not something he needed to prioritize. But he did. Quietly. Effectively. And within weeks, the narrative that had once threatened to destroy her began to collapse. Evidence surfaced that discredited the accusations. Inconsistencies exposed the weakness of the claims made against her. And slowly, the same people who had turned against her began to reconsider, to question, to shift their stance. And Elena knew that wasn't coincidence. That was Adrian. But just as things started to stabilize, just as the balance began to return, something else entered the picture. Someone who had been waiting, watching, and unlike the rest, she was not interested in shifting narratives. She wanted control. Her name was Vanessa Yates, the woman behind the accusation, the one who had set everything in motion. And she wasn't done yet. Because for Vanessa, this was never just about competition. It was personal, built on years of being second, overlooked, overshadowed by someone she believed did not deserve the position she held. And seeing Elena rise again, not alone, but beside Adrian Cole, was not something she was willing to accept. So she changed her approach. If she couldn't destroy Elena directly, she would go after the one thing holding her up: the marriage. And this time, she wouldn't rely on accusations. She would create something far more dangerous: doubt. And the moment doubt enters something built on a contract instead of trust, it doesn't break immediately. It waits, grows, and when it finally surfaces, it doesn't just damage what's there. It exposes everything that was never meant to be real in the first place. Vanessa Yates understood something most people didn't: that destroying a person directly was rarely as effective as destabilizing what supported them. And in Elena Voss's case, that support had become Adrian Cole, not just his name, not just his influence, but his presence, the quiet authority that had begun to reshape how the world saw her. And Vanessa had no intention of confronting Elena head-on again. Not when she could dismantle everything from a place no one would immediately question. She didn't start with Elena. She started with Adrian. Because men like Adrian Cole were predictable in one way, not in their actions, not in their decisions, but in how the world approached them. People wanted something from them: power, access, advantage, and Vanessa knew exactly how to position herself within that pattern, not as a rival, not as a threat, but as an opportunity, someone useful, someone aligned with his level, someone who belonged in the same rooms without needing an introduction. At first, Elena told herself it didn't matter, that whatever Adrian did outside of their agreement was none of her business, because this was never real. It was a contract, a clean arrangement with a clear ending, and she had agreed to that from the beginning. So there was no reason for her to pay attention to who spoke to him, who stood too close, or who smiled a little too confidently when he walked into a room. But that lie didn't last long, because the first time she saw Vanessa Yates standing next to him, laughing softly like she belonged there, something in Elena shifted in a way she didn't expect. Not loud, not obvious, but enough to make her look twice, enough to make her stay still for a second longer than she should have, because Vanessa didn't look like someone who was trying to get his attention. She looked like someone who already had it. And that was the problem. Elena didn't ask about it. She didn't bring it up. She didn't give it importance. But she noticed the way Vanessa showed up again and again, always at the right place, always at the right time, always with a reason that made her presence impossible to question, and Adrian never encouraged it. But he didn't push her away either. And for someone like Elena, that silence meant more than words ever could. Because if it truly meant nothing, why was it still happening? That question stayed with her longer than she wanted. It followed her into quiet moments, into conversations she tried to focus on, into nights where she told herself she didn't care, because caring would mean admitting something she wasn't ready to face, that somewhere between the contract, the marriage, and the life they had started sharing, Adrian Cole had stopped feeling like a stranger. And that made everything complicated. Vanessa didn't rush things. She didn't need to. She understood patience better than most people, and instead of forcing herself into Adrian's space, she allowed herself to exist around it, just close enough to be seen, just distant enough to seem harmless. And then one evening, she changed her approach. She went to Elena, not as a rival, not as an enemy, but as someone who had nothing to hide. Her smile was calm, almost friendly, the kind that made it difficult to immediately reject her presence. And when she spoke, her voice carried no hostility, no edge, just quiet confidence. "You're stronger than I expected." It wasn't an insult. It wasn't a compliment either. It was something in between. And not because she believed everything Vanessa said, but because she couldn't completely ignore it either, because part of her already knew Adrian wasn't simple, wasn't someone who entered into something like this without reasons that went beyond what he showed. And the more she thought about it, the more one question stayed with her. Why her? Why had he chosen her so easily? Why had he stepped in so quickly? Why did it feel like he was doing more than the contract required? And for the first time since this began, she didn't have an answer. Adrian noticed the change almost immediately. He noticed the way her silence felt different, not distant, but heavier, like she was holding something back, like she was thinking about something she hadn't decided to say yet. And while he didn't ask right away, he didn't ignore it either, because Elena was not someone who changed without reason. And Adrian was not a man who missed details. The tension between them didn't come from arguments. It came from absence, from the things they weren't saying, from the space that had slowly begun to grow between them without either of them addressing it. Until one night, it finally broke. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It just happened. Elena asked the question before she could stop herself. "Do you ever keep anything longer than you need to?" It wasn't direct, but it was clear, and Adrian understood it immediately. He didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, as if trying to understand what she was asking beneath the words. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was something else in it this time, something that hadn't been there before. "I don't hold on to things that don't matter." The answer was simple. But it wasn't enough, because Elena didn't look away. She didn't drop it, and that was when something shifted, because Adrian realized this wasn't about the contract anymore. This wasn't about the arrangement. This was about her. And for the first time since this began, he didn't keep his distance. He stepped closer, enough to touch her, enough to change the space between them. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more deliberate, the kind that didn't leave room for misinterpretation. "You're still here, Elena." That was it. No explanation. No long speech. But it said everything. Because if she didn't matter, she wouldn't be. And Elena felt it. Not just the words, but the truth behind them. And for a moment, everything else faded. The contract, the timeline, the rules they had set from the beginning. None of it felt as certain as it did before. Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being temporary. And neither of them knew how to pretend it still was. For a moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them wasn't physical anymore. It was everything they hadn't said finally catching up to them. And Elena realized something she hadn't been ready to admit until now. This was no longer about Vanessa. It wasn't even about the contract. It was about him. About the way his presence had slowly become something she relied on without noticing. About the way his silence carried more meaning than other people's promises. About the way he had never asked her to stay, but had never once made it easy for her to leave. And that was when it finally became clear. Vanessa hadn't created doubt. She had exposed it. Because the real question was never whether Adrian could replace her. It was whether Elena could walk away from him. Adrian watched her carefully, as if he already knew where her thoughts were going, as if he had been waiting for this moment longer than she realized. And for the first time since this began, there was no distance left in the way he looked at her. No calculation, no restraint, just certainty. You're thinking about leaving. It wasn't a question, and Elena didn't deny it, because lying now would have been pointless. I was, she admitted quietly. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy, final in a way that made everything feel like it was about to change. Adrian nodded once, not in agreement, not in acceptance, but like he had expected it. Then go. The words landed softer than she expected, and somehow, that made them heavier. Because he didn't try to stop her. He didn't argue, didn't remind her of the contract, didn't give her a reason to stay. He just let her choose. And that was the moment everything shifted. Because Elena understood something instantly. If he had tried to convince her, it would have been easier to leave. If he had given her reasons, she could have argued against them. But he didn't. He trusted her to decide. And for the first time since this began, that choice felt heavier than anything she had carried before. So she stepped back, not away from him, but into herself, into the truth she had been avoiding. Because leaving would mean going back to a life where she was alone in every decision, where everything depended on her and only her, where no one stood beside her unless they had something to gain. And staying meant something else entirely, something uncertain, something real, something she could no longer control. And that scared her more than anything Vanessa had said. But when she looked at Adrian again, really looked at him, she saw something she hadn't allowed herself to see before. He wasn't holding her there. He was giving her the option to leave, because he believed she wouldn't. That was the difference. And that was when Elena made the only decision that felt honest. I'm not going anywhere. The words were quiet, but they settled between them with a weight neither of them could ignore. Adrian didn't react immediately, but something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, not relief, recognition, like something he had already known, had just been confirmed. Because this was no longer an arrangement. No longer an agreement built on conditions and timelines. This was a choice. And for the first time since everything began, they were both making it. Not because they had to, not because it was convenient, but because they wanted to. And somewhere in that quiet moment, Elena finally understood the truth she had been circling from the very beginning. She didn't stay because of the contract. She didn't stay because she needed him. She stayed because walking away from Adrian Cole was the one thing she no longer wanted to do. Before we close this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.